member for Fairfax.
Mr Speaker, I move that so much the standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the Electricity Infrastructure Legislation Amendment Bill of 2025, having earlier been referred to the Federation Chamber by way of a programming declaration, being returned to the House immediately, and all debate occurring in this chamber. Mr Speaker, I don't know what sort of protection racket the Labor Party is running here, but based on the actions to date on the issues reflected in this bill, we have had a deliberate attempt on the part of the responsible minister to avoid scrutiny, and there is no chance that this bill is to be considered non-controversial. In order for a bill to go from the House to the Federation Chamber as a substitute for debate would typically involve both the opposition and government agreeing to it being passed over to the Federation Chamber. That usually happens when it's not controversial. But the bill that we want to have debated in this House introduces a form of retrospectivity in its application. That is, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy has put forward a piece of legislation which will change the rules of the game. He's done so in the form of the legislation which should be debated in this chamber, but we now know from the government they want to shove it under the carpet and set it up to the Federation Chamber so it is not fairly debated. Mr Speaker, since when has legislation which has retrospective application been non-controversial? Since when? When has that ever happened? And I'm looking squarely, can I say, Mr Speaker, at the Labor members who are in this chamber today, and I welcome them to name the precedent of all those bills that had retrospective application that was so uncontroversial it was sent to the Federation Chamber. But that's what they're trying to do, Mr Speaker. That's what they're trying to do. Now, the best thing that you can say about the attempt of the Labor Party to move this bill to the Federation Chamber is that it is consistent with the minister's approach to date to hide from scrutiny when it comes to issues that are in that bill. And the issues in that bill relate to how the government manages offshore wind zones. This is only the latest example in a completely bungled mess as a result of the incompetence of the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Now, I think most people who have been following the issues of offshore wind know that Labor has already made a mess of this right across the country. Regional Australia has already been hit and hurt through a community engagement process on offshore wind which has been completely flawed, reckless indifference shown to those communities. The government has never come forward with an explanation of the economic merits of offshore wind. But what has been most hurtful has been how quickly they have disregarded concerns from regional Australia, the very people who will be most impacted from some of their offshore wind zones. I'm talking about the offshore wind zone off the coast in WA, Victoria, the two in New South Wales and the Illawarra and the Hunter. These local communities have raised very fair and reasonable concerns around the economic impact of these zones, around the social impact of these zones and also the environmental impact. On each of these occasions, in each of those zones which I've mentioned, communities have been steamrolled by a minister who has adopted a process of avoiding scrutiny. refusing to have serious questions answered. This has been the story of offshore wind under the Labor government from the time they came to office. They do not want scrutiny. Community after community with which I have met have come out with examples of very simple questions asked of government for which they do not get an answer. Why is it that the Albanese Labor government is so hell-bent on disrespecting regional communities when it comes to offshore wind? Now, the bill before the House, which Labor wants to duck-shove over to the Senate and ignore scrutiny on, again goes to offshore wind. And for those who don't know what this is all about, Mr Speaker, can I explain? After the Act was introduced under the former coalition government, it was the now Labor Minister for Climate Change and Energy which created the regulations which govern how feasibility licences are granted to developers who wish to build offshore wind projects in zones that are declared. So, the now Labor Minister created regulations for how that is managed. Consistent with everything Labor does in this portfolio, with haste and an ideological rigour just to steamroll ahead because it set its arbitrary target of 82% renewables on the grid by 2030. The minister went ahead with those regulations and introduced them, having not done his homework. Now, those regulations have since been proven to be flawed, because as the minister was applying those regulations, he was rejecting proposals in these offshore wind zones. And once a proposal was rejected, they were out of the game. Until, of course, the minister was taken to court. And the court found that, in fact, the minister had the power to still grant feasibility licences to those proponents who he had rejected. So now the minister's in big strife, because he knows full well he raced ahead, he introduced those regulations, he'd been busted, he'd been caught out. So what did he do? Well, he decided to change the regulations. And when did he do that? Did he do that with scrutiny? Did he engage with industry? Did he engage with the coalition? No, he didn't. He did it sneakily. Instead, on the 12th of December, after Parliament had risen last year, he changed the regulations to make sure that that power no longer existed. The thing is, because that change in regulation would have an adverse impact on others, it could not be applied retrospectively. So he made a mess in the first place with the regulations. Then he tried to mop up that mess with a change in regulations. And in mopping it up, he failed, because he could not apply it retrospectively. And what he really wants to do is change all the rules for the proponents who came before. And so what has he done? Last week he walked into this chamber and introduced the bill that should be debated here today. Now, I'm talking here about the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, by the way, who will never lose a moment in front of that microphone. I've never seen a faster speech than the one he made last week. In and out. No scrutiny did he want, none at all. And now today, when we actually have a lineup of speakers on this very legislation, I mean, he's not even here. He's in his room. Seriously. There's no scrutiny. They want to pass this to the Federation Chamber. It is a disgrace. We need to have the debate here in this chamber. We need scrutiny on this legislation, anything that has retrospective application, at least deserves the scrutiny of the parliament. Even the regulations from last year are still yet to be scrutinised by the Senate committee.